Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to this GS1 and TrueCommerce webinar on outsourced versus on-premise EDI. My name is Dennis O'Brien. I'm the Director of Standards and Solutions of GS1 Ireland, and I'm accompanied by Jerry Quinn, who's the Sales Manager of TrueCommerce Europe. I'll allow Jerry to introduce himself, give his background.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, as Dennis said, my name is Jerry Quinn. I'm the Sales Manager at TrueCommerce. Basically, I've been filling this role for the last 13 years, where we've been focused entirely on providing EDI to the UK and Irish market. Back to you, Dennis.
Okay, thank you. So today, we hope to provide you with information to help you assess whether outsourcing the EDI service for your company would be beneficial, or whether to continue to remain in-house. Jerry will give you an overview of what we mean by outsourced and on-premise EDI, and we'll take you through the issues which you may wish to consider. First of all, let me introduce GS1. We're a neutral, not-for-profit organization to administer the standards used in EDI messages. Over 2 million organizations across the globe are members of GS1, and we have offices in 112 countries which represent the interests of these members. We work with solution providers such as TrueCommerce because they've demonstrated a commitment to the use of the standards, and TrueCommerce are actually gold partners with GS1, and we work very closely together to maximize the benefits for our members. On our next slide, you'll see our Identify, Capture, Share, which encapsulates what we do as a standards body. Obviously, the visibility, reliability, and accuracy of data will lead to greater efficiency and cost savings for our members, which is our objectives here. Again, just before I hand over to Jerry, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat section on the webinar, and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. So feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. And now I'll hand over to Jerry. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. To get the ball rolling, as I mentioned in my very brief introduction, I've been with TrueCommerce about 13 years, and probably the two biggest trends I've seen during that period of time is, first of all, the general uptake of EDI in general. 13 years ago, EDI was a very difficult sell in terms of getting people to accept the concept and understand it, whereas today it's almost part of the course that most organizations are using EDI as an integral part of their offering. The second trend that I've noticed is an interesting one, is the move from what traditionally was called on-premise or in-house EDI to outsourced EDI, which is obviously the theme of this particular webinar. Before I move on to the outsourced aspect, I think it is worth just spending a little time encapsulating what we mean by on-premise. And as the slide basically says, when you have an on-premise solution, you effectively are owning your EDI service or your EDI solution. So it's effectively, it's 100% owned by yourself. When we talk about EDI in general, whether it's on-premise or outsourced, there are a number of components that go to make the overall EDI solution. And if you're doing it as an on-premise offering, then obviously you have to go out and source a provider who has the EDI software. You then buy that software, you need to install it on a hardware platform. You need to manage the communication network between you and your trading partners. You then have to do what we call the mapping, and the mapping is effectively writing the data translation between you and your trading partners. You then have to connect those trading partners, and then of course once you've done all of that, which is no mean task in its own right, you then actually have to support that from an IT and technical perspective. What we actually find is each of those components potentially can introduce risks to your business. The first one, which is always an interesting one, even if you've had a very successful deployment of an on-premise service, the question is then, do you have the resource to maintain the infrastructure and support it? And even if you do have the resource to do that, there's a question that asks, can you keep abreast of the different technologies which are being introduced by your trading partners, particularly if they're customers. And also, of course, we do see the use and the development of standards, which thankfully are being introduced to the EDI environment. I don't know, Dennis, if you've got anything you'd add around standards.
Yeah, well, obviously the use of standards makes it much more efficient, because if you develop a message for one customer and your other customers are using the same standard, the job is done. You don't have to go redevelop again. The use of a variety of proprietary standards obviously is not a great idea. You're essentially reinventing the wheel every time.
Okay, thanks. As we stay on this slide, it's also worth mentioning that when you go on premise, you need to ensure that the infrastructure you're basing your EDI service on is robust and reliable, because no doubt, as you all will know, those who are listening, that you're exchanging mission critical messages with your trading partners, and it's actually absolutely imperative that you can send or receive an order and likewise an invoice. And if you're a fresh produce supplier, it's imperative that you can send an ASN at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're loading your vehicles. So reliability and robustness are absolutely critical. The next component in terms of those that make up your overall EDI solution is the mapping. Now, mapping is an interesting thing. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's the connection of messages or message formats between you and your trading partners. And this is an area where, even if you have the skill to set this in the first instance, the question arises, can you keep abreast of the standards and changes that are being introduced as more and more people get into EDI? And I'll give you two very good examples of things we experienced in the last 12 months. If we look at the bullet point there, which says changes to existing maps, that's an example of, it takes B&Q as a good example. They introduced an ASN as a new message type. Prior to that, they were doing orders and invoices, and we had to make sure that we could assist all of our customers to comply with the change in map that had been addressed and requested by B&Q. That may be a bit difficult thing to do if you're having to do it in-house. A second example, for those of you who are more on the retail side, many of you will experience that Morrison's decided to change their EDI message formats from a TraderCom standard to an Edifact standard. Again, not a major thing for an outsourced provider, but if you're doing this in-house, there's a natural expectation rather that you will have Edifact skills when in fact you may not have that skill set if you've never used it before. And of course the other component is both B&Q and Morrison's issued discrete timelines by which this work has to be done. So even if you have the competence in-house, do you have the availability to do it within the timelines that's been set by your customers? Moving on to a specific area, this is aimed mainly at those of you in the audience who are potentially considering rolling EDI out to your suppliers. A very mission critical part of that is the ability to onboard suppliers. And by onboarding, we simply mean connecting them to your network. And it's imperative, if you're doing onboarding with suppliers, that you make it as easy as possible for them to do so, by offering them lots of options in terms of how they can connect, in terms of the standards that are available. There's actually a skill in doing this, and the danger you have with an on-premise offering is that you have a crack at this. It might be reasonably successful, but you can't get all of your suppliers on, so you park it. And then what happens is other priorities come into play, and you have a diluted focus on getting the remaining suppliers onboarded. So that's just something to bear in mind if anyone in the audience is looking at bringing on their suppliers. It's making sure that you've got the skill, the focus, and the commitment to get those suppliers onboarded. Excuse me, right. once you've got your on-premise solution up and running, and hopefully if you decide to go that route, you've been successful in doing it, that's really just the start of the process. Because once you're up and running, you're then in the position where you have to make sure that you're providing a quality service ongoing to both your business users internally and, more importantly, to your trading partners. And I think the interesting thing when it comes to EDI and technical support is when EDI is running, it's a bit like electricity. You know, you switch it on and you've done a good job, it should run satisfactorily. The key thing around support is what happens when there's a problem. And that we have experienced with on-premise solutions that have transitioned across to TrueCommerce is often where the problems arise. Is you're very conversant with running the system, but if a problem occurs at the customer end or a networking end, how available are you and what skills do you have at your disposal to address those issues as and when they occur. So it's when things go wrong that you really need to be aware of. So basically that was a little bit of a biased view, if I'm brutally honest, on the on-premise, and I'm a little bit biased because we've always been outsourced, which takes me into the area of what is an outsourced EDI solution. Well, effectively there are two, and you need to be wary of this if you are considering going out to market and looking for an EDI provider. There's what we call basic outsourced, and that's effectively where, if you like, you're outsourcing the couple of the components I mentioned on an earlier slide. You're outsourcing the infrastructure and you're outsourcing the network, but everything outside that still remains your responsibility. So the mapping, the trading partner connectivity is still your remit. What we class as an outsourced EDI service is what we call a fully managed service. So that effectively means that all of the components that I referred to on an earlier slide are actually managed on your behalf by your EDI partner. And the components are, if not identical, very similar to the components I listed on what's required on an on-premise solution. So you need a hosted infrastructure. Sorry, that is slightly different. Obviously, if you're doing on-premise, the infrastructure is within your four walls. But if you're outsourcing to someone like TrueCommerce or others, you have what we class as a hosted infrastructure, whereby the hardware is all managed and maintained by your EDI provider. You obviously have to implement the service or the application itself, which your partner should do for you. Your partner would be responsible for onboarding your customers and or suppliers. They would continually monitor the service that's being provided to you in terms of its uptime and its availability. And they would also be available from an IT and technical support perspective to help you and your trading partner community. When we talk about a hosted infrastructure, basically in the world of TrueCommerce, we work with IBM as our business partner, and this is really the backbone to the service that you're providing. And it's the quality of the hosted infrastructure that's giving you the scalability, the security, and the resilience that you need to run a mission-critical application such as EDI. And it's also the quality of service provided by the infrastructure is enabling you to meet SLAs, which may be asked of you by your trading partners in terms of the quality of service that you provide to them. So the infrastructure is a key component, and it's on which the whole application actually sits. The second area, which again I touched on premise, is the onboarding, the implementation, trading partner onboarding. When it comes to trading partners, if it's customers, you tend to find that customer onboarding is a little bit more complex but less common. And by that I mean you will have customers asking to be added to your EDI network, probably maybe one or two at a time based on how successful you are in winning new business with particular customers. And normally your customer will know exactly what they want. And therefore, if you're working with an outsourced provider such as ourselves, it is likely we will know your customers, we will know the people working within their organization, and most importantly, we know what their EDI standards are and how we can comply with them. If it's supplier facing, that's slightly different in as much the shoe is on your foot in terms of what standards you're going to use with your suppliers. But this is where you really need the dedicated team who can work with you to ensure maximum onboarding of your supplier community. Moving forward, we talk about the continuous monitoring of the service. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, switching the service on is one thing, but making sure that it's continuously available. And for those of you in retail and fresh produce, that has to be a 24/7 availability. And it's absolutely critical that every message is arriving at the right place at the right time. And what you would expect from a fully managed EDI service provider, they will be monitoring your network, and they will be making sure that documents are arriving when they should do, or they'll be highlighting to you if something has or hasn't happened. Examples of that might be, again, if you're in maybe the retail sector and you're expecting an order from a customer at 5 o'clock in the morning, you need to make sure that your EDI provider has got the skill set and monitoring techniques to ensure that if at 5:15 that order hasn't arrived, that an alert is sent out based on whatever business rules are mutually agreed to action that there could be a potential problem. So that's an example of message delivery. And a second example would be, we had one recently where we were sending invoices to a customer, but we couldn't technically get the invoices delivered. A good EDI service provider will take on the onus of calling up your customer, asking if there are any technical issues, and if there are, helping them to resolve. In this particular instance, the example in question was the customer's FTP server was down. They were unaware of that. We notified them, they switched it back on, and we successfully delivered the invoices to your customer without causing any consternation or concern at your end. So just in summary on the technical support, it needs to be fast problem resolution. If an order hasn't been received or you can't deliver an invoice, it's not something that can wait for 24, 48 hours. In certain sectors, it's imperative that you've got 24/7. And it's also important that we keep abreast of what your trading partners are doing in terms of what's coming downstream. I mentioned the B&Q and Morrison's examples a little bit earlier and the problems they could bring to you. Well, typically, because we're 100% focused on EDI, we're aware of what your customers are up to from an EDI perspective, and we can keep you ahead of the game in terms of complying with their standards or their requirements. We're starting getting towards the end of the webinar now. A couple of things, or a number of things you really need to ask yourself. The first two, do you have the internal resource required to not only install but to maximize the benefits available from EDI? I think if you're considering on-premise, one thing you need to take in the equation is, will you reach what we call the tipping point? And that's effectively, there's a really strong case for doing things on-premise if you're only going to connect to maybe a small number of trading partners. So if you're going to connect to customer 1, that's fine, customer 2's fine, customer 3's fine. You may then find as customer 4 arrives, you're actually supporting 4 different standards and 4 different communication methods and a host of different message types. That's where it was described to me by one of our existing customers as the tipping point. They can do it, they could do it, but they no longer want to do it because it's becoming an overhead and a major resource log from their perspective. So that's something to bear in mind if you're considering on-premise versus outsourced. I mentioned the risks earlier on, and that's something, again, you really need to consider seriously about. If you're running your own EDI service and all the key components that go to make up that service, what risk are you putting the business in, particularly if a lot of that information is owned by 1 or 2 key people in the business? And this is something which we come across quite often. It's pretty common that when people come to us and are looking to move from on-premise to outsourced, it's quite often because they've realized, the company's realized, that a lot of the intelligence and knowledge is basically at the hands of one or two key people. And if they should leave the business, where does that leave you from a risk point of view? And then the final 2 points really relate to you and you understanding your business. I mean, you know what resources you've got, you know what your priorities are, you know which projects can ripple to the top in terms of cost savings and benefits. And as a rule, we tend to find, whether it's on-premise or outsourced, the EDI is absolutely an area where cost savings can be made, because the less human intervention there is in the exchange of messages, the better, the less errors are going to occur if you're doing EDI, whether it be on-premise or outsourced. Really, I'm not going to read this slide out to you. You can see this is just, if you like, the TrueCommerce sales pitch. It's just giving you a little bit of background on who we are, what we do. I'll give you 5 to 10 seconds just to have a quick view of that. I think I'll finish off in terms of my positioning on this is, from a TrueCommerce perspective, we are very biased because we've only ever had an outsourced solution. We've had it since 1999. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, over the past 13 years, outsourcing is probably the biggest change or the biggest trend that we've noticed as people reach those tipping points and decide to move from on-premise to outsource. If there are any questions, I know Dennis has asked. Have we got any questions come through?
There are, yeah. That's great, Jerry. Thank you very much for that. That's very comprehensive. Yeah, there's been a great interest, all right, and I think we've something like 101 registered for the webinar, so we obviously have a couple of questions coming out of it. The first one is probably for yourself, Jerry. Do you know what percentage of companies are using on-premise versus outsourced EDI?
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, if they're a TrueCommerce customer, it's 100% outsourced because that's all we do. But on a more general basis, to be honest, Dennis, we don't have numbers. It's a good question, something we will look into in terms of seeing what the split is. But of course, it's very difficult to, I guess, to come to a definitive number, because if people are doing on-premise EDI, we probably, we don't know who they are or how they're doing it. But we will take a look into that. It'd be interesting to back what I've said, rather than saying it's just a trend and something that we've noticed over the past 13 years or so, to put some hard numbers against that. So I'll take that as an action.
Okay, excellent. I think the second question is probably more for ourselves. It's how can I familiarize myself more with GS1 standards for EDI? Well, the first thing I'd say is to obviously make a note of our email address and make contact with us. And we can try and provide you with training. We do a range of training, both online, in company, and occasional classroom sessions. So if you make contact with us, we'll make sure we notify you when the next training session or training webinar is going on, and you're more than welcome to take part. Obviously, you're welcome to make contact with us at any time. The third question, Jerry, again, I'll pass this one on to you if you don't mind. You provided examples of the risks of an on-premise solution, but are there any risks associated with an outsourced solution?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the risk that immediately springs to mind is, and I guess it's like any service that you're looking to source, is you need to make sure you pick the right provider. So depending on what your requirements are, if you're looking at outsourced, if you bear in mind the slide I ran through earlier on basic versus fully managed service, if you're looking for a fully managed service, make sure you don't pick a basic solution, because that's going to leave you short of what you're expecting. But in terms of risk, it's back to my biasness and the fact that we've always been on premise. I think it's just a case of selecting the right provider and doing the appropriate amount of due diligence. I think if you pick the right provider, then I can't see any specific risks, because you're dealing with it, if you like, an organization who are looking after all aspects rather than just an individual or two that you might be doing with an on-premise solution.
Okay, so they're the specialists in it. They'll have all the experience to handle any issue that might come up. Well, finally, I'd just like to say thank you to all our listeners for such a high level of interest in the webinar, and also to say please don't hesitate to make contact with TrueCommerce or GS1 if you require any further information, or if we can help you in any way in your EDI decision making. And I would also say, thanks to TrueCommerce, we'd like to give you back 5 minutes of your day to go and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.